The millionaire rejected the waitress who claimed to be pregnant. 20 years later, he was paralyzed when served by a young man identical to him. The Monarch Hotel's grand ballroom glittered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between tables, their movements precise and nearly silent. This wasn't just any corporate dinner. It was the annual gathering of Chicago's elite financial players, and George Fletcher stood at its center. George adjusted his custom-tailored Armani jacket as he surveyed the room. At 45, he had the confident posture of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. His salt-and-pepper hair was impeccably styled, and his steel-gray eyes calculated the worth of everyone they fell upon. "Another remarkable year, George," said Harold Michaels, CEO of Midwest Trust, raising a glass of 20-year-old scotch. "Your company's performance has been nothing short of miraculous in this market." George's thin lips curved into what passed for his smile. "Miracles are for churches, Harold. I deal in inevitabilities." The table erupted in appreciative laughter. This was George's world, one where money talked and everyone else listened. Fletcher Capital Partners had doubled its portfolio again this year, even as other firms struggled through the recession. When George spoke, boardrooms fell silent. When he invested, markets moved across the room. Anna Robinson balanced a tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease. At 28, she had worked at the Monarch for 3 years, longer than most servers lasted in the high-pressure environment. She was known for her efficiency and quiet dignity, qualities that had caught George's attention 6 months ago at another corporate function. Their affair had been brief but intense. George, separated from his wife Catherine, but not yet divorced, had pursued Anna with the same determination he applied to acquiring companies. Anna, intelligent and warm-hearted, despite her modest background, had been genuinely taken by his attention, unlike the socialites who usually surrounded him. She spoke honestly and laughed without calculation. For a few precious weeks, George had shown her a different side of himself, vulnerable, almost human. Then, as suddenly as it began, he ended things, citing complications with his divorce. Anna had accepted the breakup with grace, expecting nothing more, until the pregnancy test changed everything. Now, as she served drinks to Chicago's wealthiest, she felt the weight of her secret becoming unbearable. 3 missed periods and morning sickness had confirmed what she already knew. She was carrying George Fletcher's child. She hadn't planned to tell him tonight. But seeing him holding court, so smug and self-assured, something inside her snapped. Anna placed her tray on a service table and straightened her uniform. Her supervisor caught her eye from across the room, giving her a questioning look. She ignored him and walked purposefully toward George's table, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "May I speak with you for a moment?" George looked up, annoyed at the interruption. Recognition flickered across his face, followed quickly by a warning glare. "I'm in the middle of dinner," he said coldly. "It's important," Anna persisted. "It concerns both of us." The table fell silent, all eyes shifting between the powerful financier and the waitress who had dared to interrupt him. "Whatever you need to say can wait until after the event," George replied, dismissal clear in his tone. "I'm pregnant," Anna said, the words escaping before she could reconsider. "The baby is yours, George." The silence that followed was absolute. Crystal glasses froze midway to lips. Forks hovered over plates of seared scallops. George's face remained impassive, but a dangerous flush crept up his neck. "Is this some kind of joke?" he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You know it's not. We need to talk about this." George stood slowly, towering over her. For a fleeting moment, Anna thought she saw something like fear in his eyes, quickly replaced by cold fury. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "But people like you disgust me." Anna took a step back, stunned by the venom in his voice. "George, please. Do you really think anyone would believe that I would touch someone like you?" He gestured dismissively at her uniform. "A waitress trying to trap a wealthy man. How original." Tears welled in Anna's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." "Know what, your lies?" George's voice rose further. "Your place is in the trash, along with your pathetic attempt at extortion." The room had gone completely silent now, all pretense of privacy abandoned as the drama unfolded. Anna felt dozens of pairs of eyes on her, judging, condemning without knowing anything about her. "Security," George called out. "This woman is harassing me and disrupting a private event." Two men in dark suits materialized at Anna's side. "Sir?" one asked, directing the question to George rather than to her. "Escort her out, and make sure she never sets foot in this hotel again." Anna's supervisor appeared, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Ms. Robinson, come with me now." As they led her away, Anna looked back once. George had already resumed his seat, leaning in to say something that made his tablemates laugh nervously. Just like that, she had been erased. In the employee locker room, her supervisor's words washed over her in waves. "Terminated effective immediately. Completely unprofessional. Reputation of the monarch. Final paycheck will be mailed." Anna changed out of her uniform mechanically, her mind blank with shock. She had expected anger, perhaps denial, but the public humiliation, the utter dehumanization. It was as if George had reached inside her chest and crushed something vital. Outside, Chicago's spring evening held no comfort. The city skyline glittered much like the ballroom she'd just left. Beautiful, cold, and utterly indifferent to her pain, she pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. A baby, George's baby, and now, no job, no references, and a reputation in tatters as she waited for the bus that would take her back to her small apartment. Anna made a decision. She wouldn't stay in Chicago, wouldn't subject herself to whispers and pity. She had some savings, enough to start somewhere new, somewhere her child could grow up without the shadow of tonight's humiliation. The bus pulled up with a hydraulic sigh. As Anna stepped aboard, she took one last look at the Monarch Hotel rising into the night sky like a glittering fortress. "Goodbye, George," she whispered, one hand still on her stomach. "You'll never know what you've thrown away." Anna's hands trembled as she unfolded the crumpled map on her lap. The bus rumbled beneath her, carrying her away from downtown Chicago to Riverdale, a modest neighborhood on the city's outskirts. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the Monarch. 3 weeks of packing up her life and avoiding the pitying glances of former co-workers who'd heard about her breakdown. "End of the line, miss," the bus driver called, jolting Anna from her thoughts. She stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, clutching her single suitcase. The rest of her belongings would arrive later, what little she had managed to keep after breaking her apartment lease early. The late May sunshine felt out of sync with the heaviness in her chest. The building before her, a 3-story walk-up with faded brick, looked nothing like the gleaming high-rise she'd left behind. But the rent was affordable, and the landlord hadn't asked too many questions when she paid 3 months in advance with her savings. "You must be Anna," a voice called from the building's entrance. A woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled into a loose bun emerged, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'm Elaine, your landlady. Apartment 2B is ready for you, honey." Anna managed a small smile. "Thank you for arranging everything so quickly." "No trouble at all. You said on the phone you needed a fresh start." Elaine's eyes flickered briefly to Anna's midsection, her expression neutral. "We all need those sometimes." The apartment was small but clean. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, and a living space that would feel cramped once her few pieces of furniture arrived. Still, it was hers, a sanctuary away from the life she was leaving behind. As Elaine handed over the keys, Anna felt the first real sense of solitude since the pregnancy test had turned positive, with the door closed behind her. She slid down against it until she sat on the bare floor, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach. "Just you and me now, little one," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "Just you and me." The memory came unbidden that night as Anna lay on the air mattress that would serve as her bed until her furniture arrived. 6 months ago, the first time she'd seen George Fletcher up close. She'd been serving drinks at a charity gala, navigating the crowded ballroom with practiced ease. When she'd approached his table with a tray of champagne, he'd actually looked at her. Not through her, like most guests did with the staff, but at her. "You're new," he'd said, his voice deep and commanding. "I've worked here 3 years, sir," she'd replied, surprised by his directness. Something had flickered in his gray eyes, amusement, perhaps, or curiosity. I meant new to me. The encounter should have ended there. Instead, he'd sought her out later that evening. Catching her during her break in the staff area, he'd been charming, asking questions about her life as if her answers genuinely interested him. When he'd asked for her number, Anna had hesitated. She knew who George Fletcher was. Everyone in Chicago's financial district did. Divorced, powerful, 20 years her senior, but there had been something vulnerable in his gaze, something that spoke to her in a language she couldn't quite name. Their first date had been at an obscure jazz club where he claimed no one would recognize him. He'd been different there, relaxed, even playful, for those few weeks. He'd shown her glimpses of a man few ever saw, one who quoted poetry and admitted to secret fears. The morning sickness dragged Anna back to the present, a harsh reminder of where those stolen moments had led her. Rushing to the bathroom, she wondered bitterly if George ever thought about her at all. July brought sweltering heat to Chicago. Anna's pregnancy was beginning to show, a small but unmistakable curve beneath her summer dresses. She'd found work at a small diner 6 blocks from her apartment, the kind of place that asked few questions and paid in cash at the end of each shift. "You sure you should be on your feet all day?" Denny, the short-order cook, asked one afternoon as Anna rubbed her lower back between orders. "Don't have much choice," she replied, forcing a smile. Her savings were dwindling faster than she'd anticipated, between doctor's visits, prenatal vitamins, and preparing for the baby. Every dollar counted. The bell above the door jingled, and Anna turned automatically to greet the new customer. Her coffee pot clattered against the counter as she recognized the woman entering the diner. Catherine Fletcher, George's ex-wife, strode in as if she'd stepped into a quaint exhibit rather than a working-class eatery. Her Chanel suit and perfectly coiffed blonde hair stood out starkly against the diner's vinyl booths and linoleum floors. Their eyes met, and Anna knew with sickening certainty that this was no coincidence. Catherine's thin smile confirmed it as she approached the counter. "Anna Robinson, I presume." Her voice was honey over ice. "May I have a moment of your time?" They sat in the farthest booth, Anna perched on the edge of her seat as if ready to flee. Catherine perfectly composed. "I'll be direct," Catherine said, not touching the coffee Anna had mechanically poured. "I know about your situation with George." Anna said nothing, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "He doesn't know I'm here, of course," Catherine continued. "Our divorce may be final, but we share business interests that could be affected by scandal." She opened her designer handbag and removed an envelope, sliding it across the table. "This should cover your expenses and ensure your discretion." Anna didn't touch the envelope. "I haven't contacted George since that night, and I'd like to keep it that way." Catherine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Consider this an investment in everyone's peace of mind." The amount written on the check inside the envelope contained more zeros than Anna had ever seen, enough to start fresh somewhere truly new, enough to give her child a comfortable life. "Why would you do this?" Anna asked, still not touching the envelope. "Let's call it women's solidarity," Catherine replied, standing to leave. "Or insurance against future complications. Either way, cash the check, move far from Chicago, and we'll consider the matter closed." After Catherine left, Anna sat staring at the envelope until Denny called her name, breaking the trance. That night, she wrote 2 letters, one accepting the check, the other returning it torn to pieces. In the end, she burned both, watching the papers curl and blacken in her kitchen sink. "We don't need their money," she told her unborn child, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "We'll make our own way." That night, Anna dreamed of kitchens, warm, fragrant spaces where she'd learned to cook alongside her grandmother years ago. She woke with the first genuine smile in months, a plan forming in her mind. "Brandon, sweetie, it's time to wake up." Anna gently brushed the dark hair from her 4-year-old son's forehead. The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains of their apartment, casting warm patterns across his sleeping face. Even at this young age, Brandon's features were beginning to take shape in ways that made Anna's heart catch. The strong jawline, the thick eyebrows, the determined set of his mouth even in sleep. All echoes of George. "5 more minutes, Mommy," Brandon mumbled, pulling the blanket over his head. "The sun's already up, and Mrs. Diaz will be here soon," Anna said, pulling the covers back. "Don't you want pancakes before I go to work?" At the mention of pancakes, one eye popped open. Anna smiled. Recognizing the negotiation tactic for what it was, her son might have inherited his father's looks, but his shrewd mind was all his own. "With blueberries," he bargained. "If you're dressed in 5 minutes." It had been 4 years since that night at the Monarch Hotel. 4 years of reinventing herself, of learning to be both mother and father, of working jobs that left her hands raw and her feet aching. After leaving the diner, Anna had cycled through a series of positions: line cook at a Greasy Spoon, prep chef at a busy lunch counter, caterer's assistant on weekends, often juggling 2 or 3 at once to make ends meet. The apartment they shared now was their third since leaving downtown Chicago, slightly larger than the first, in a building with fewer drafts and a small playground nearby. It wasn't much, but Brandon had never known anything different. Mrs. Diaz arrived just as Anna was placing blueberry pancakes in front of her son. The elderly woman who watched Brandon during Anna's shifts lived 1 floor down and had become like family over the past 2 years. "Buenos dias," she greeted them warmly. "And how is my little man today?" "I'm learning about dinosaurs at school," Brandon announced proudly through a mouthful of pancake. "Chew, then talk," Anna reminded him gently, grabbing her coat and the bag containing her chef's whites and knives. These days, she worked at Salvatore's, a busy Italian restaurant where she'd started as a dishwasher before working her way up to assistant line cook. "I'll be back by 8, she told Mrs. Diaz, kissing Brandon's syrupy cheek. "Be good for Mrs. Diaz. Okay, honey." "I'm always good," he replied with such seriousness that both women had to suppress their smiles. Outside, the October air carried a sharp bite. Anna wrapped her scarf tighter as she hurried to catch the bus 3 years ago. 3. She'd finally sold the beautiful pearl bracelet George had given her during their brief relationship. The only gift from him she'd kept. The money had paid for her culinary certificate from the community college. Completed 1 night class at a time while Brandon slept at Mrs. Diaz's apartment. The bus was crowded with morning commuters. As Anna found a spot to stand, holding the overhead rail, she caught her reflection in the window, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dark circles under her eyes despite the concealer she'd hastily applied. At 32, she looked older, the soft curves of her face replaced by more defined angles. Her hands, once soft from the luxury hotel's mandatory lotions, were now marked with small burns and calluses. The badges of a working chef, Salvatore's kitchen was already in full swing when Anna arrived. The breakfast shift was ending, and preparations for lunch were underway. The familiar chaos greeted her: the clatter of pots, the hiss of steam, the rapid-fire Spanish and Italian from the line cooks. "You're late, Robinson," barked Sal, the owner and head chef, though his watch showed she was actually 2 minutes early. "Sorry, chef," Anna replied automatically, heading to the locker room to change as she tied her apron. Maria Vasquez, the sous chef, appeared beside her, in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled into a tight bun and arms muscled from decades of kitchen work. Maria was a force to be reckoned with, and the closest thing to a mentor Anna had found. "Ignore him," Maria said, nodding toward the door. "He's in a mood because the Gazette food critic might be coming this week." Anna's eyes widened. "Really? That could be huge for the restaurant. Or a disaster," Maria shrugged. "Either way, it means all hands on deck. You're on sauce station today." Anna nodded, secretly pleased. Sauce station was a step up from her usual prep work and vegetable sides. It meant Sal was recognizing her skills, even if he'd never admit it. The shift blurred into a familiar rhythm. Chop, stir, taste, adjust, plate, repeat. 1,000 movements, 100 dishes, all requiring precision and speed. Anna found peace in the work, in the way her hands moved almost independently of conscious thought. In the kitchen, there was no room for dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. There was only now, only the next dish to perfect. During the brief lull between lunch and dinner service, Anna collapsed onto a milk crate in the alley behind the restaurant. Stretching her aching back, Maria joined her, offering a cigarette that Anna declined. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the older woman smoking, Anna sipping water. "Your hollandaise was good today," Maria finally said. "You've got a feel for it now." From Maria, this was high praise. Anna smiled. "I practiced at home last weekend. Brandon helped." "That boy of yours," Maria chuckled. "How old is he now?" 4, starting pre-K this year." Maria nodded, taking a long drag of her cigarette. "He asks about his father yet." The question caught Anna off guard. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Simple things. Where is he? Why doesn't he live with us? And what do you tell him?" Anna looked down at her hands, at the small burn on her wrist from a splash of hot oil earlier. "The truth, a simplified version, that his father and I weren't meant to be together, but that he came from love. The last part was a lie, but a necessary one, she believed." Maria stubbed out her cigarette with deliberate care. "My father left when I was 6, she said matter-of-factly. "My mother told me he was dead. I believed her until I was 16 and saw him with his new family at a mall in Phoenix." Anna winced. "I'd never lie to Brandon like that." "Good." Maria stood, brushing off her chef's pants. "Because secrets have a way of surfacing no matter how deep you bury them. Better the boy knows a hard truth than a comfortable lie." Back inside, as Anna prepared for dinner service, Maria's words echoed in her mind. That night, after tucking Brandon into bed, she pulled out the small box she kept hidden in her closet. Inside was the photo taken at the hospital the day Brandon was born. Anna exhausted but radiant, the newborn cradled against her chest, both of them alone in the frame. On the back, she'd written the words she hoped would someday help her son understand. "Brandon, my son, you were born rejected, but you will be remembered as a man of honor. Someday," she thought, as she returned the photo to its hiding place. He would need to know the whole story, but not yet. Not until she could tell it without the bitterness that still caught in her throat when she thought of George Fletcher and that terrible night that had changed everything. The storefront was nothing special. A narrow space wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, with a faded "for rent" sign taped inside the grimy window, but Anna couldn't tear her eyes away from it. After walking Brandon to school, she'd taken a different route home and spotted it purely by chance. "Excuse me," she called to the man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the laundromat. "Do you know who's renting that space?" The man, elderly with a face lined like a road map, leaned on his broom. "Old man Gianelli owns the whole block. His nephew manages the properties. There's a number on the sign." Anna jotted down the information, trying to contain the excitement bubbling inside her. For the past 6 months, she'd been selling homemade lasagna and cannoli to her neighbors on weekends, recipes she'd perfected under Maria's guidance at Salvatore's. What had started as a way to make extra cash had quickly developed a following in the building. "You should open your own place," Mrs. Diaz had told her just last week after sampling Anna's tiramisu. "Your food, it speaks to the heart." The idea had seemed impossible then. Now, standing before the empty storefront, Anna allowed herself to imagine it. A small kitchen, serving takeout meals to busy families and workers. Nothing fancy, just good food at fair prices. Brandon was 10 now, old enough to help out after school and on weekends. Smart enough to understand when she explained that this could be their chance to build something of their own. "Mom, are we really going to have our own restaurant?" Brandon asked that evening, his dark eyes wide with excitement as Anna sketched layout ideas at their kitchen table. "Not a restaurant exactly," Anna corrected, smiling at his enthusiasm. "More like a takeout place. People can order food to go. Or maybe we'll have a couple of tables. We'll start small." Brandon nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness he applied to everything. "But it will be ours, right? Not like Salvatore's where you work for someone else." "That's right," Anna confirmed, struck by his perception. "If we can make this work, it will be all ours." "Can I help name it?" Anna pulled him close, breathing in the clean scent of his hair. "I was counting on it." The meeting with Gianelli's nephew went better than Anna had dared hope. The rent was manageable, barely, and he agreed to a 6-month lease to start, with an option to extend. The space had previously been a bakery, so it already had some of the basic equipment and proper ventilation for a commercial kitchen. "You'll need permits," he warned, handing her the keys. "Health department inspections. It's a lot of hoops to jump through." "I'll manage," Anna said, with more confidence than she felt. The real challenge came when she approached the bank for a small business loan. The loan officer, a man about her age in a cheap suit, barely glanced at the business plan she'd painstakingly prepared. "No collateral, limited credit history, no business experience," he listed, flipping through her application. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Robinson, but you're simply too high risk." Anna swallowed her disappointment. "I have references from my current employer, Salvatore's is a respected establishment. Being a cook doesn't qualify you to run a business, he interrupted. Perhaps your husband could co-sign? The familiar sting of being a single mother in a world that still looked askance at women without partners flared in Anna's chest. There is no husband, she said stiffly. Just me and my son. The loan officer's expression said everything. His words didn't. That night, after Brandon was asleep, Anna sat at their small kitchen table and did the math again. Between her savings, a cash advance on her credit card, and selling her mother's antique silver set, the one family heirloom she'd managed to keep, she could just manage the first month's rent, basic equipment, and initial inventory. It would be tight, with absolutely no room for error. You're crazy, Maria told her when Anna gave notice at Salvatore's. In this economy, with a kid to support. Maybe, Anna admitted, but I have to try. I've spent 10 years working for other people. I want Brandon to see that we can build something of our own. Maria's weathered face softened. You've always been stubborn. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded check. My retirement savings was going toward a trip to Spain. Spain will still be there in another year. Anna stared at the check, tears threatening. Maria, I can't. It's an investment, not charity. Maria cut her off gruffly. I expect returns, and you'll need help at least for the first few months. My arthritis is acting up anyway. Sal's been looking for a reason to replace me with someone younger and cheaper. The renovations took every spare minute of the next 3 weeks. Brandon proved surprisingly handy, carefully painting the walls a warm yellow, while Anna scrubbed years of grime from the industrial stove. Neighbors from their apartment building pitched in. Mr. Castillo, a retired electrician, fixed the faulty wiring. Mrs. Diaz sewed simple curtains for the front window. The day before opening, Anna stood in the center of the small space, taking it all in. The gleaming counters, the neatly organized shelves, the handwritten menu board. It wasn't much, just a few tables and chairs salvaged from thrift stores, a counter where customers could place orders, and the kitchen visible behind it. What do you think? She asked Brandon, who was arranging the silverware with scientific precision. He looked around critically, then nodded with satisfaction. It's perfect, Mom. The sign above the door, painted by Mr. Castillo's artistic granddaughter, read simply, Anna's Kitchen. They had debated for weeks about the name, with Brandon lobbying hard for something more exotic. But in the end, simplicity had won out. Opening day dawned bright and crisp, a perfect October morning. Anna had been up since 4, preparing the day's offerings, lasagna, chicken parmesan, and Maria's famous meatballs, along with salads and freshly baked bread. What if nobody comes? Brandon asked as they unlocked the front door, his usual confidence wavering. Then we'll have a lot of leftovers for dinner, Anna replied, refusing to voice her own fears. But people will come. Good food always finds its audience. By noon, they had served 15 customers, mostly curious neighbors and friends from their apartment building. By closing time, the day's food was completely sold out, and Anna had a list of orders for the next day. We did it, Mom, Brandon exclaimed as they counted the day's modest earnings. We really did it. Anna smiled, exhausted but exhilarated. First day down, kiddo. Thousands more to go. As they locked up that night, walking the short distance home with their arms around each other, Anna felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced before. For the first time since that terrible night at the Monarch, she felt truly free of George Fletcher's shadow. This small business, built with her own hands and determination, belonged to her alone, her and Brandon. She glanced down at her son, noticing with a pang how tall he was getting, how his features were maturing into a face that would someday be strikingly handsome. There was no denying whose son he was. The resemblance grew stronger every year, but watching him count their earnings with such care, explaining to her the importance of setting aside profit margins with terms gleaned from his business math class, Anna knew that what mattered most was inside, and there, in his kindness, his work ethic, his quiet determination. There, he was truly her son. A gentle spring rain tapped against the windows of what was no longer simply Anna's Kitchen. Sleek new signage adorned the storefront. Brandon's Bistro, spelled out in elegant script above the door. What had begun as a modest takeout counter with a few tables had transformed, over the past decade, into a respected local restaurant. Anna studied the reservation book, satisfied by the full slate for the evening. What had started as a desperate gamble had blossomed beyond her wildest expectations. They'd expanded 3 years ago, taking over the vacant space next door when the check-cashing place closed. The additional square footage had allowed for a proper dining room with white tablecloths and ambient lighting. "Mom, the produce delivery is short on heirloom tomatoes again," Brandon's voice carried from the kitchen. At 20, he'd grown into a striking young man, tall and lean with sharp, defined features that echoed his absent father's. But where George's eyes had been cold and calculating, Brandon's held a warmth and depth that was entirely his own. Anna checked her watch. "I'll call them. We need those tomatoes for the special tonight." Maria, now in her 60s but still formidable, chopped vegetables with machine-like precision. "I told you we should grow our own. My cousin has that urban farm in Pilsen. Next you'll have me raising chickens in the alley," Anna teased. Though the idea wasn't entirely unappealing, farm-to-table was trending, and Brandon was always looking for ways to distinguish their restaurant from the competition. The kitchen staff moved with practiced efficiency around them. What had started with just Anna, Maria, and Brandon had grown to a team of 8. Line cooks, prep cooks, and dishwashers. The front of house employed another 6, including a sommelier Brandon had insisted on hiring last year, arguing that their expanded wine list demanded expertise. "I'll be back by 4, Anna told Maria, grabbing her purse. "Brandon has class until 3, but he'll be here for dinner service." Outside, Chicago glistened under the light rainfall. Anna pulled her coat tighter, still marveling at how much had changed. They'd moved from their apartment to a small townhouse 5 years ago, using a portion of the restaurant's profits as a down payment. Brandon had his own bedroom now, and a study space he'd converted into a mini test kitchen where he experimented with new recipes. Anna's path took her past the community college where Brandon was completing his business degree. 10 years had transformed her son from the solemn, helpful boy who'd carefully painted the original kitchen's walls to a confident young man with a sharp mind for both culinary arts and business strategy. "It makes sense, Mom," he'd explained when he'd announced his plan to major in business rather than culinary arts. "I already learn cooking from you and Maria every day. What we need is someone who understands how to grow the restaurant, handle taxes, maybe even think about franchising someday." Franchising. The word still made Anna's head spin. How had they come so far from those desperate days after leaving the Monarch Hotel? The produce supplier apologized profusely for the shortage and promised to source the tomatoes from another vendor by afternoon. On her way back, Anna stopped at the bank, not as a supplicant this time, but as a valued customer with an appointment to discuss expanding their business line of credit. "Your credit score is excellent, Ms. Robinson," the loan officer, a woman this time, said, reviewing the documents, "and the restaurant's financials are impressive. You've built quite a success story." Anna thought of the days when she'd been rejected for even a modest loan, when she'd counted pennies while Brandon slept in their cramped apartment. "It wasn't easy," she said simply. "I've eaten at Brandon's bistro several times," the woman continued. "The food is wonderful. Your son works there too, correct?" Anna nodded, pride warming her voice. "He practically grew up in that kitchen. He's the reason for our success. It's unusual to name a restaurant after your child rather than yourself," the woman observed. Anna smiled. "It was his idea, actually. On our 5th anniversary of opening, he surprised me with the new sign, said the restaurant should bear the name of its future, back at the bistro." The dinner prep was in full swing. Brandon had returned from his classes and was bent over a soup pot, tasting and adjusting the seasoning with a focused expression Anna recognized, the same look she wore when perfecting a dish. "Tomatoes will be here by 5, she announced, hanging up her coat. "Crisis averted." Brandon looked up, his smile transforming his serious face. "Great. Professor Jenkins canceled our last class, so I've been working on the spring menu revisions." He handed her a sheet of paper filled with his neat handwriting. The proposed dishes showed his growing confidence as a chef. Seasonal ingredients prepared with classic techniques, but updated with contemporary twists. Anna felt a surge of pride mixed with a touch of wistfulness. Soon, he would outgrow her teaching. "These look amazing," she said honestly, "especially the scallop dish with the citrus reduction. I was inspired by that article on Nordic cuisine you showed me," Brandon replied, returning to his soup. The reviewer from the Tribune is coming next week. I want to have everything perfect." Anna raised her eyebrows. "The Tribune? When did this happen?" "I got the call this morning, apparently. Someone from the Chicago Culinary Foundation recommended us." He spoke casually, but the flush of pride on his face was unmistakable. A review in the Chicago Tribune could transform their neighborhood success into citywide recognition. Anna felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. They'd worked so hard, built everything from nothing, to be recognized now, to have their efforts validated by the city's premier newspaper. "Your father would be so proud," Maria said to Brandon, then froze, glancing apologetically at Anna. An awkward silence fell, though Brandon knew the basics of his father's rejection. It remained a sensitive subject rarely broached in the busy day-to-day operations of the restaurant. Brandon cleared his throat. "Professor Robert helped me with the business plan for the menu updates. He thinks we could qualify for that Small Business Excellence Award he mentioned." Anna seized the change of subject gratefully. Professor Robert had become something of a mentor to Brandon over the past year, an economics professor who'd taken a special interest in the young man's potential. "He's coming for dinner tonight. Actually," Brandon added, "said he's bringing a potential investor who's interested in local businesses." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. By 6 o'clock, the dining room was filled with the pleasant hum of conversation and the clink of silverware on plates. Anna moved between the kitchen and front of house, overseeing the flow of service with practiced ease. Professor Robert arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by an elegant woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Elaine Chen, a venture capitalist with an interest in authentic culinary experiences. They were seated at the chef's table, a special spot near the kitchen where guests could observe the cooking process and receive special attention from the staff. "Brandon has remarkable talent," Professor Robert told Anna as she served their appetizers personally. "Not just in the kitchen, but in understanding what makes a business sustainable. That's rare." Anna smiled, watching her son explain the preparation of a dish to a captivated guest at another table. "He's always been special." Later, as the evening wound down and the last customers lingered over coffee, Anna caught Brandon staring thoughtfully at a family celebrating a birthday in the corner. A father, mother, and teenage son laughing together over a shared dessert. "You okay?" she asked softly. Touching his arm, Brandon blinked, his expression clearing. "Yeah, just thinking about the Tribune review. This could really put us on the map, Mom." But Anna had seen the flash of something in his eyes. A question, a longing, quickly suppressed. It was the same look she'd noticed more frequently as he matured, especially around Father's Day, or when father-son activities arose at school. She'd given him everything she could: love, stability, a future to be proud of, but there remained a space she couldn't fill, a question she couldn't fully answer. For the first time in years, Anna found herself wondering what George Fletcher was doing now. Whether he ever thought of the son he'd rejected before birth, whether he'd recognize his own features in the talented young man who bore his blood but not his name. George Fletcher straightened his tie as the elevator ascended to the 47th floor of Fletcher Tower at 65. He still maintained the commanding presence that had served him well throughout his career. Though the years had etched deeper lines around his eyes and mouth, his dark hair was now completely silver, lending him the distinguished appearance of a statesman rather than a ruthless financier. The company had changed too. Fletcher Capital Partners had evolved from a boutique investment firm to a diversified financial services corporation, with offices in 8 countries. George had shepherded the transformation with his characteristic precision, anticipating market shifts and positioning the company for continued growth, even as he began to contemplate retirement. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher." His executive assistant greeted him as he stepped off the elevator. "The senior management team is assembled for the quarterly review. I've placed the reports on your desk." George nodded, barely registering her words. After 40 years in business, these quarterly meetings had become routine to the point of tedium. The faces changed, the numbers fluctuated, but the fundamental dynamics remained the same: success, growth, profit. His corner office offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the city he'd conquered financially, if not personally. George stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the urban landscape that had been the backdrop to his life. A life that, despite all outward appearances of success, felt increasingly hollow. "Sir?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Daniels wanted me to remind you about dinner tonight." 7 o'clock at Alinea. Cancel it, George said impulsively. I have other plans. The lie came easily, though he had no other commitments. The truth was that he couldn't bear another evening of forced conversation with associates who were more interested in his connections than his company. Richard Daniels, his presumptive successor, was competent and ambitious, but utterly lacking in originality or genuine passion. Like so many in George's orbit these days, the quarterly meeting proceeded as expected. Reports were delivered, strategies discussed, decisions approved. George found his mind wandering as the CFO detailed the latest earnings figures. When had he last felt truly excited about anything? When had the thrill of the deal, the satisfaction of outmaneuvering competitors, begun to fade? Mr. Fletcher? The room had fallen silent, all eyes on him. I agree with Mr. Daniels's assessment, he said smoothly, though he hadn't heard a word of whatever had been proposed. Proceed as recommended. Later, as the executives filed out, Daniels lingered. About dinner, sir. Alinea is impossible to book on short notice. Perhaps another evening. George waved dismissively. I need a break from the usual spots anyway. Somewhere new. There's a place that's getting excellent reviews lately, Daniels suggested. Brandon's Bistro, intimate setting, innovative menu. I hear they just received a glowing Tribune review. Something about the name tickled at George's memory, but he couldn't place it. Where is it? North Side. Not as upscale an area as you're used to, but the food is supposedly outstanding. Shall I make a reservation? No, George said, reaching for his coat. I'll handle it myself. The restaurant was busier than George had expected for a Tuesday evening. The hostess, a poised young woman with a warm smile, checked the reservation book. Fletcher, party of 1, she confirmed. We have a lovely table by the window. If that suits you, sir. The dining room balanced elegance with comfort, white tablecloths and quality stemware, but nothing ostentatious. George noted the mix of clientele. Young professionals, middle-aged couples, a table of what appeared to be university professors engaged in animated discussion. Not his usual crowd, but there was an authenticity to the atmosphere that appealed to him. Your server will be Brandon, the hostess informed him as she placed a menu before him. He'll be with you shortly. George settled in, surveying the room. The restaurant had character. He had to admit, the walls featured black and white photographs of Chicago landmarks, interspersed with vintage kitchen implements. A rolling pin mounted like artwork, antique copper molds arranged in a pleasing pattern. Good evening, sir. Welcome to Brandon's Bistro. George looked up, a casual greeting on his lips that died when he saw the young man standing beside his table. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was looking at a ghost, or more precisely, at himself 40 years earlier. The server, Brandon presumably, couldn't have been more than 21, with dark hair and striking features that mirrored George's own at that age. The same jawline, the same set of the shoulders, even the way his eyebrows drew together slightly as he waited for a response. Are you all right, sir? The young man's voice held genuine concern. George realized he'd been staring. Yes. Sorry, you remind me of someone. Brandon smiled politely. I get that sometimes. May I tell you about our specials this evening? As the young man detailed the chef's recommendations. George found himself unable to focus on the words. Instead, he noted the elegant way Brandon's hands moved as he spoke, the confidence in his presentation, the intelligence in his eyes. Familiar traits all, but softened somehow. Humanized in a way George recognized but couldn't quite place. I'll start with the scallops, George managed, when a response was clearly expected. And the duck for my main course. Excellent choices. Our sommelier can suggest pairings, or if you have a preference. I trust your recommendation, George said, still trying to process the uncanny resemblance. Throughout the meal, George found himself watching Brandon whenever the young man approached his table. There was something about him beyond the physical similarity, a quality of focused attention that made each patron feel genuinely valued. George had seen that quality before, though he couldn't immediately place where. The food was exceptional, innovative without being pretentious, each element serving the dish rather than showcasing technical virtuosity for its own sake. George found himself enjoying a meal more than he had in years. Is everything to your satisfaction? Brandon asked. appearing at just the right moment. "Beyond expectation," George replied honestly. "Have you worked here long?" The young man's smile widened with obvious pride. "Since the beginning? Actually, it's a family business. My mother started with just a small takeout counter when I was 10. She must be very proud." "I hope so," Brandon said. "Everything I know about food and service, I learned from her." As Brandon moved away to attend to other guests, George felt an odd tightness in his chest. Family business. The words resonated with an unexpected pang. What would it have been like to build something with a son of his own? To pass on knowledge? To share pride in a joint accomplishment? George had never married again after his divorce from Catherine. There had been relationships, of course, but none that lasted. No children. His legacy would be financial, not personal. Buildings bearing his name, investment funds, charitable foundations managed by trustees with no emotional connection to the man whose wealth had created them. When Brandon returned to clear the table, George found himself asking, "Is the owner here tonight? I'd like to compliment the chef personally." "My mother's in the kitchen. Yes, I'll let her know you'd like to speak with her." George savored the last of his wine, mentally rehearsing a compliment that would sound genuine rather than perfunctory. He rarely bothered with such niceties. But tonight felt different somehow. "Mr. Fletcher." The voice behind him sent a jolt of recognition through George's body before he even turned to look. A voice from the past, one he'd heard in dreams and occasional waking moments of regret over the years. Anna Robinson stood before him, looking both entirely different and exactly the same as she had 20 years ago. Her blonde hair was shorter now, styled in a practical bob, and fine lines framed her eyes and mouth. She wore chef's whites, a testament to her role in the kitchen rather than serving staff. But her eyes, those he recognized immediately, along with the graceful way she held herself, even in obvious shock. "Anna," he breathed, the name emerging unbidden. Her composure was remarkable. If not for the slight tightening of her hands at her sides, he might have thought she was merely greeting any customer. "George," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Brandon mentioned a guest wanted to speak with the chef. I didn't realize it was you." The implications crashed over George in a wave of understanding. Brandon, the family resemblance, 20 years, the bistro's name. George couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes," Anna said simply. "He is." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as George absorbed this confirmation. A son, his son, a young man he'd watched all evening without knowing, admiring qualities that echoed his own, but were tempered with something else. Something that must have come from Anna. "I had no idea you were in Chicago," George managed, his usual eloquence deserting him. "Or that you had a restaurant." Anna's smile was polite but reserved. "We've been here all along. Brandon's bistro is the culmination of many years of work." George glanced across the room, where Brandon was explaining a dessert to an elderly couple, with the same focused attention he'd shown all his guests. "He's remarkable." Something in Anna's expression softened slightly at the genuine awe in George's voice. "Yes, he is. If you'll excuse me, I need to return to the kitchen. Your meal is complimentary tonight." "That's not necessary." "I insist," Anna said firmly, then added after a pause, "Perhaps we can talk another time when we're less busy." As she walked away, George sat frozen, his mind racing with implications. A son, a child he'd rejected before birth. Now a young man any father would be proud to claim. The cruel words he'd spoken that night at the Monarch Hotel echoed in his memory, making him flinch at their callousness. The hostess appeared with his coat. "I hope you enjoyed your evening, Mr. Fletcher. Will we be seeing you again?" George looked once more at Brandon, who was now laughing at something a customer had said, his head thrown back in a gesture that was painfully familiar. "Yes," George said quietly. "I believe you will." George couldn't sleep that night. He paced his penthouse apartment, bourbon in hand, replaying the evening's revelation. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Brandon's face, his face, looking back at him. The next morning, he called his most trusted investigator. "I need information on a restaurant called Brandon's Bistro," George said when Maxwell answered. "And its owners?" "Anna and Brandon Robinson." "Anything specific you're looking for?" Maxwell asked. George hesitated. "Everything. Business history, reviews, personal background. Be discreet." While waiting for Maxwell's report, George threw himself into work with unusual intensity. Colleagues noticed his distraction but knew better than to comment. On Thursday, just as he was leaving the office, his private line rang. "I have that information," Maxwell said. "Would you prefer I email it or deliver in person?" "Come to the penthouse in an hour," George instructed. Maxwell arrived precisely on time, a leather portfolio under his arm in his 50s. With a forgettable face and meticulous manner, he'd handled George's most sensitive inquiries for 15 years. Brandon's bistro began as Anna's kitchen, approximately 10 years ago. Maxwell began, laying out photographs and documents on George's coffee table. Started as a takeout counter in a less desirable neighborhood, Anna Robinson invested roughly $25,000 of personal savings, plus a private loan from Maria Vasquez, her former colleague at Salvatore's Italian restaurant, where she worked as a line cook. George examined the photos. Exterior shots of a modest storefront evolving over the years into the elegant establishment he'd visited. The business grew steadily. 5 years ago, it was renamed Brandon's Bistro and began focusing on fine dining rather than takeout. They've received increasingly positive reviews, culminating in last month's Tribune piece that called them Chicago's most exciting culinary newcomer. Maxwell handed George several newspaper clippings and printouts of online reviews. "And the personal information?" George asked, his throat suddenly dry. Maxwell hesitated, then opened another folder. Anna Robinson, 48, single mother, no other family in Chicago, moved to Riverdale shortly after leaving her position at the Monarch Hotel 20 years ago. George winced at the mention of the hotel. Brandon Fletcher Robinson, 20 years old, currently enrolled at Chicago City College studying business management, top of his class. Maxwell slid over a printout of Brandon's academic records. His birth certificate lists you as the father, though there's no record of any paternity test or legal acknowledgement. George stared at the birth certificate copy. Seeing his name listed as father sent a jolt through him unlike anything he'd experienced in his decades of business dealings. "They've lived in the same modest townhouse for 5 years, Maxwell continued. "Prior to that, various apartments, no legal issues, excellent credit rating currently. The restaurant is financially solid, not wildly profitable but steadily growing. They recently turned down an acquisition offer from Midwest Hospitality Group." The investigator paused. "There's something else you should know. Your ex-wife, Catherine, attempted to contact Brandon 2 years ago." George's head snapped up. "Catherine? Why?" "Unclear. She approached him under the guise of being interested in investing in the restaurant. According to my source, Brandon declined after consulting with his mother." George dismissed Maxwell shortly after, needing solitude to process what he'd learned. He spread the photos across his desk. Brandon at high school graduation, receiving a culinary award, standing proudly beside Anna in front of their restaurant. A life, a whole life George had missed, had willfully rejected. He poured another bourbon, remembering that night at the Monarch. He'd been terrified, though he'd hidden it behind cruelty. Terrified of scandal, of responsibility, of having his carefully ordered life disrupted in that moment of fear. He'd made a decision that had shaped 2 decades and 3 lives. The next morning, George canceled his meetings and drove to Brandon's Bistro, hours before opening time. A delivery truck was parked outside, and he glimpsed staff receiving produce through the back entrance. He'd nearly decided to leave when Anna emerged from the front door. Adjusting a sign listing the day's specials, she froze when she saw him. "We need to talk," George said quietly. Anna glanced back at the restaurant, then nodded. 10 minutes. There's a coffee shop around the corner." They walked in silence. 2 people connected by history but essentially strangers. At the cafe, George ordered for both of them, remembering with a pang that Anna took her coffee with milk, no sugar. "How did you find the restaurant?" Anna asked when they were seated. "A colleague recommended it. Pure coincidence." George paused. "I had no idea you were still in Chicago, or that you'd had the baby." "His name is Brandon," Anna said firmly. "And he's not a baby anymore." George nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. "He's exceptional. Anyone would be proud to have such a son." Something in Anna's eyes softened slightly. "Yes, he is. He's worked incredibly hard to help build our business. I've learned about your journey. George admitted. "From the small takeout place to now, it's remarkable what you've accomplished." Anna's expression hardened again. "Did you hire someone to investigate us?" "I needed to understand," George said, not denying it, "to fill in 20 years of absence." Absence. Anna's laugh held no humor. "That's a gentle word for what happened." George looked down at his coffee. "I behaved abominably that night. There's no excuse for it." "No, there isn't." Anna's voice was level, controlled. "But that's ancient history now. Why are you here, George? What do you want?" The question hung between them. What did he want? George had asked himself the same thing repeatedly since that night at the bistro. "I'd like to meet him properly," George finally said. "To know my son." Anna studied him, her eyes searching his face as if looking for traces of the younger man who had hurt her so deeply. "That's not my decision to make. Brandon knows about you, who you are, what happened. If he wants to meet you, that's his choice." "Does he hate me?" George asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake. "Brandon doesn't hate easily," Anna replied. "It's not in his nature, but he has no reason to welcome you into his life either." George nodded, understanding the implicit warning. "Will you tell him I'd like to meet him?" Anna sipped her coffee, considering, why now, George, after 20 years, why suddenly develop an interest in the son you rejected? The question struck at the heart of George's own confusion. Was it merely seeing himself in Brandon, some midlife crisis or fear of mortality, or something deeper, a recognition of what truly mattered after decades of chasing hollow success? "I'm not the same man I was then," he said finally. "Seeing him, seeing what you've built together, it made me realize what I threw away." Anna stood, gathering her purse. "I'll tell him you'd like to meet. The decision will be his. Don't contact the restaurant again. I'll reach out if he's interested." As she turned to leave, George called after her. "Anna, did you ever tell him anything good about me?" She paused, then turned back slightly. "I told him you gave me a beautiful bracelet once, that for a brief time there was tenderness between us." A sad smile touched her lips. "I didn't want him growing up thinking he came from nothing but cruelty." After Anna left, George remained at the table, turning his coffee cup slowly between his fingers. He thought of his legacy, the buildings bearing his name, the fortune he'd amassed, all of it meaningless compared to what he'd just learned. Somewhere in this city was a young man with his blood, his features, his determination, a son who had grown up without him, who had thrived despite his absence, or perhaps because of it. For the first time in decades, George Fletcher found himself hoping for something he couldn't buy, intimidate, or negotiate his way into. A second chance he knew he didn't deserve as he walked back to his car. He passed Brandon's bistro again. Through the window, he glimpsed Brandon instructing the waitstaff, gesturing with the confident authority of someone twice his age. George paused, watching unobserved as his son, demonstrated a proper table-setting technique, his expression serious until someone made a joke that transformed his face with sudden, unguarded laughter. In that moment, George knew with absolute certainty that regardless of whether Brandon ever agreed to meet him, he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that chance. Word count, 1388. Here's a revised version to meet the word count requirement. Chapter 7. Investigation and Discovery. George couldn't sleep that night. He paced his penthouse apartment, bourbon in hand, replaying the evening's revelation. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Brandon's face. His face, looking back at him. The next morning, he called his most trusted investigator. "I need information on a restaurant called Brandon's Bistro," George said when Maxwell answered. "And its owners, Anna and Brandon Robinson. Anything specific you're looking for?" Maxwell asked. George hesitated. "Everything. Be discreet." While waiting for Maxwell's report, George threw himself into work with unusual intensity. On Thursday, just as he was leaving the office, his private line rang. "I have that information," Maxwell said. "Would you prefer I email it or deliver in person?" "Come to the penthouse in an hour," George instructed. Maxwell arrived precisely on time, a leather portfolio under his arm, in his 50s. With a forgettable face and meticulous manner, he'd handled George's most sensitive inquiries for 15 years. Brandon's Bistro began as Anna's Kitchen approximately 10 years ago. Maxwell began, laying out photographs and documents. Started as a takeout counter in a less desirable neighborhood. Anna Robinson invested roughly $25,000 of personal savings, plus a private loan from Maria Vasquez, her former colleague at Salvatore's Italian restaurant. George examined the photos. Exterior shots of a modest storefront evolving over the years into the elegant establishment he'd visited. The business grew steadily. 5 years ago, it was renamed Brandon's Bistro and began focusing on fine dining. They've received increasingly positive reviews, culminating in last month's Tribune piece that called them Chicago's most exciting culinary newcomer. And the personal information? George asked. His throat suddenly dry. Maxwell hesitated, then opened another folder. Anna Robinson, 48, single mother, moved to Riverdale shortly after leaving her position at the Monarch Hotel 20 years ago. George winced at the mention of the hotel. Brandon Fletcher Robinson, 20 years old, currently enrolled at Chicago City College studying business management. Top of his class. Maxwell slid over a printout of Brandon's academic records. His birth certificate lists you as the father, though there's no record of any paternity test or legal acknowledgement. George stared at the birth certificate copy. Seeing his name listed as father sent a jolt through him, unlike anything he'd experienced in decades. They've lived in the same townhouse for 5 years, Maxwell continued. The restaurant is financially solid. Not wildly profitable, but steadily growing. They recently turned down an acquisition offer from Midwest Hospitality Group. The investigator paused. There's something else. Your ex-wife, Catherine, attempted to contact Brandon 2 years ago. George's head snapped up. Catherine, why? She approached him under the guise of being interested in investing in the restaurant. According to my source, Brandon declined after consulting with his mother. After Maxwell left, George spread the photos across his desk. Brandon at high school graduation, receiving a culinary award, standing proudly beside Anna in front of their restaurant. A life, a whole life George had missed, had willfully rejected. The next morning, George canceled his meetings and drove to Brandon's Bistro hours before opening time. He glimpsed staff receiving produce through the back entrance. He'd nearly decided to leave when Anna emerged, adjusting a sign. She froze when she saw him. We need to talk, George said quietly. Anna glanced back at the restaurant, then nodded. 10 minutes. There's a coffee shop around the corner. They walked in silence. At the cafe, George ordered for both of them, remembering with a pang that Anna took her coffee with milk, no sugar. How did you find the restaurant? Anna asked when they were seated. A colleague recommended it. Pure coincidence. George paused. I had no idea you were still in Chicago, or that you'd had the baby. His name is Brandon, Anna said firmly, and he's not a baby anymore. George nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. He's exceptional. Something in Anna's eyes softened slightly. Yes, he is. He's worked incredibly hard to help build our business. I've learned about your journey, George admitted, from the small takeout place to now. It's remarkable what you've accomplished. Anna's expression hardened again. Did you hire someone to investigate us? I needed to understand, George said, not denying it. Why are you here, George? What do you want? The question hung between them. What did he want? I'd like to meet him. Properly, George finally said. To know my son. Anna studied him. That's not my decision to make. Brandon knows about you, who you are, what happened. If he wants to meet you, that's his choice. Does he hate me? George asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake. Brandon doesn't hate easily, Anna replied. But he has no reason to welcome you into his life either. Will you tell him I'd like to meet him? Anna sipped her coffee. Why now, George, after 20 years? I'm not the same man I was then, he said. Seeing him, seeing what you've built together, it made me realize what I threw away. Anna stood. I'll tell him. The decision will be his. Don't contact the restaurant again. I'll reach out if he's interested. As she turned to leave, George called after her. Anna, did you ever tell him anything good about me? She paused. I told him you gave me a beautiful bracelet once, that for a brief time, there was tenderness between us. I didn't want him growing up thinking he came from nothing but cruelty. As George walked back to his car, he passed Brandon's Bistro again. Through the window, he glimpsed Brandon instructing the waitstaff, gesturing with confident authority. George paused. watching as his son demonstrated a table-setting technique, his expression serious until someone made a joke that transformed his face with sudden laughter. In that moment, George knew with absolute certainty that regardless of whether Brandon ever agreed to meet him, he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that chance. Anna's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the mise en place for the evening's dinner service. The morning's encounter with George had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. 20 years of carefully constructed distance had crumbled in an instant when she saw him standing outside the restaurant. "Mom, are you okay?" Brandon appeared beside her, concern etched on his features. "You seem distracted." Anna forced a smile. "Just thinking about the special for tonight. Do you think the truffle oil is too much?" Brandon gave her a skeptical look. "You've been staring at those carrots for 5 minutes without chopping them. What's really going on?" Anna set down her knife. Brandon had always been perceptive, even as a child. Lying to him now seemed both futile and wrong. "Your father came by this morning," she said quietly. Brandon's expression froze, his body suddenly tense. "My father? You mean George Fletcher?" "Yes. He wanted to talk." "About what?" Brandon's voice was carefully neutral, but Anna saw the storm brewing behind his eyes. "About you. He wants to meet you properly." Brandon turned away, busying himself with adjusting the flame under a simmering stock pot. "Why now, after 20 years of nothing?" "I asked him the same question," Anna replied. "He said, seeing you made him realize what he'd thrown away." A bitter laugh escaped Brandon's lips. How convenient for him. Anna watched her son carefully. Despite his outward composure, she recognized the turmoil he was experiencing. It was the same conflict she'd observed whenever the subject of his father arose. A mixture of curiosity, resentment, and something deeper that Brandon rarely articulated. "You don't have to meet him," she said gently. "This is entirely your decision." Brandon was silent for a long moment. "Did you tell him about Catherine's visit 2 years ago?" "No," Anna admitted. "But apparently he knows. He had someone investigate us." "Of course he did," Brandon muttered. The great George Fletcher, always in control. Maria entered the kitchen, immediately sensing the tension. "What happened? You two look like someone died." Brandon turned to her. "My father wants to meet me." Maria crossed herself reflexively. "George Fletcher, after all this time." "You knew who my father was?" Brandon asked. Surprised? "Your mother needed someone to talk to," Maria explained, patting his cheek affectionately. "And I've kept enough secrets in my life to know how to hold one more." Brandon looked between the two women who had raised him, suddenly feeling like the ground beneath him was shifting. "Who else knows?" "Professor Robert, the staff. No one else," Anna assured him. "Just Maria, and that was only because you needed someone to curse him out in Spanish when you were too polite to do it yourself." Maria finished with a small smile that brought a reluctant grin to Brandon's face, breaking some of the tension. He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that painfully reminded Anna of George. "I need some time to think about this," he said finally. "Take all the time you need," Anna replied. "There's no rush." But later that night, after closing, Brandon lingered in the kitchen long after the staff had departed. Anna found him sitting alone at the chef's table, staring at his laptop screen. "What are you looking at?" she asked, sliding into the chair opposite him. He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was the Fletcher Capital Partners website, displaying George's corporate portrait. Distinguished, powerful, remote. "He doesn't look much like me," Brandon said, though they both knew it was a lie. The resemblance was undeniable, especially now that Brandon had grown into his adult features. "You have his jawline," Anna said softly, "and his eyes, but your heart is your own." Brandon closed the laptop. "Why did you never try to get child support from him?" "We struggled for years, Mom. All those double shifts, the tiny apartments, eating leftover restaurant food. It was a matter of pride, I suppose," Anna admitted. "And protection. I didn't want him to have any legal connection to you that he could use to hurt us later." She hesitated. "His ex-wife offered me money to disappear, right after you were born." Brandon's eyes widened. "Catherine, when she approached me about investing in the bistro, she wanted to see if you were really George's son," Anna confirmed. "I recognized her immediately when you showed me her business card." "Why didn't you tell me then?" because you were already upset about her. Anna reached across the table to take her son's hand. Brandon, I've tried to protect you from all of this your whole life. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe you needed to know everything sooner. Brandon squeezed her hand. You did what you thought was best. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you have anything of his? Anything he gave you? Anna nodded slowly. One thing. She disappeared into her office and returned with a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate pearl bracelet that Brandon had never seen before. He gave me this about a month before that night at the hotel, Anna explained. It was his grandmother's. He said it brought him luck, and he wanted me to have it. Brandon studied the antique piece, its pearls glowing softly under the kitchen lights. Why did you keep it after everything he did? Because for a little while, there was something real between us, Anna said honestly, and because I thought someday you might want something tangible from him. Beyond just DNA. Brandon closed the box, handing it back to her. I think I do want to meet him, he said finally. Just once, to see for myself what kind of man he is now. Are you sure? No, Brandon admitted with a wry smile. But I'm curious, and maybe it's time to close this chapter one way or another. Anna nodded. Understanding. I'll let him know. 3 days later, George Fletcher returned to Brandon's bistro. The restaurant was closed for a private event. Though in reality, it was closed to provide privacy for this meeting. Anna had arranged for staff to take the night off, leaving just the three of them. George arrived precisely on time, looking somehow both commanding and uncertain as he entered the empty restaurant. He carried a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he said to Brandon, who stood stiffly beside the bar. I'm doing this for me, not for you, Brandon replied evenly. I've wondered about you my whole life. Now I have questions I want answered. George nodded. That's fair. I'll answer anything you ask. Anna moved toward the kitchen. I'll give you two some privacy. No, Brandon said quickly. Please stay, Mom. Anything he has to say to me, he can say in front of you. George's eyes flickered between them, registering the deep bond evident in their interaction. Of course I wouldn't have it any other way. They sat at a corner table. An awkward family reunion 20 years delayed. George placed the package on the table but didn't mention it. So, Brandon began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Why now? What changed? George considered his answer carefully. Seeing you that night, recognizing myself in you, it shocked me into confronting what I'd done, what I'd missed. You didn't miss anything, Brandon said. Missing something implies you wanted to be there in the first place. George winced visibly. I deserved that, and worse. He looked directly at Brandon. I was a coward. I was afraid of scandal, of responsibility, of anything that threatened the image I'd built for myself. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I reacted with panic, then cruelty. That's putting it mildly, Anna murmured. I'm not asking for forgiveness, George continued. What I did is unforgivable. I'm simply answering your question honestly. Brandon studied the man before him. Wealthy, powerful, yet somehow diminished in this context. Were you ever going to look for us, if you hadn't stumbled into my restaurant by chance? George's hesitation told Brandon everything he needed to know. I thought about you, George said finally. More often than you might believe. But no, I probably wouldn't have actively searched for you, that's the truth. Brandon nodded, appreciating at least his honesty. Then what do you want from me now? George glanced at the package on the table. Just to know you. To have some connection, whatever you're willing to allow. I don't expect to play father suddenly. That role belongs to the person who actually raised you. He looked at Anna with genuine respect. And if I say no, Brandon asked, if I tell you I want nothing to do with you, then I'll respect your decision, George said simply. But I hope you won't. Brandon glanced at his mother, drawing strength from her steady presence. Then he reached for the box his father had brought. Word count, 1424. I apologize for exceeding the word limit. Here's the revised version, Chapter 8. Confrontations and Revelations. Anna's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the mise en place for the evening's dinner service. The morning's encounter with George had unsettled her, more than she cared to admit. 20 years of carefully constructed distance had crumbled in an instant when she saw him standing outside the restaurant, "Mom, are you okay?" Brandon appeared beside her, concern etched on his features. "You seem distracted." Anna forced a smile. "Just thinking about the special for tonight." Brandon gave her a skeptical look. "You've been staring at those carrots for 5 minutes without chopping them. What's really going on?" Anna set down her knife. "Your father came by this morning." Brandon's expression froze, his body suddenly tense. "My father? You mean George Fletcher?" "Yes, he wanted to talk." "About what?" "About you. He wants to meet you properly." Brandon turned away, busying himself with adjusting the flame under a simmering stockpot. "Why now? After 20 years of nothing?" "I asked him the same question," Anna replied. "He said, seeing you made him realize what he'd thrown away." A bitter laugh escaped Brandon's lips. "How convenient for him." "You don't have to meet him," she said gently. "This is entirely your decision." Brandon was silent for a moment. "Did you tell him about Catherine's visit 2 years ago?" "No," Anna admitted. "But apparently he knows he had someone investigate us." "Of course he did," Brandon muttered. "The great George Fletcher, always in control." Maria entered the kitchen, immediately sensing the tension. "What happened?" "You two look like someone died." Brandon turned to her. "My father wants to meet me." Maria crossed herself reflexively. "George Fletcher, after all this time." "You knew who my father was?" Brandon asked, surprised. "Your mother needed someone to talk to," Maria explained. "And I've kept enough secrets in my life to know how to hold one more." Brandon looked between the 2 women who had raised him. "Who else knows?" "No one else," Anna assured him. Later that night, after closing, Brandon lingered in the kitchen. Anna found him sitting alone at the chef's table, staring at his laptop screen. "What are you looking at?" she asked. He turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was the Fletcher Capital Partners website, displaying George's corporate portrait. "He doesn't look much like me," Brandon said, though they both knew it was a lie. "You have his jawline," Anna said softly, "and his eyes, but your heart is your own." Brandon closed the laptop. "Why did you never try to get child support from him?" "We struggled for years. It was a matter of pride." "I suppose," Anna admitted, "and protection. I didn't want him to have any legal connection to you that he could use later." "Do you have anything of his?" Brandon asked. "Anything he gave you?" Anna nodded slowly. "One thing." She disappeared into her office and returned with a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate pearl bracelet. "He gave me this about a month before that night at the hotel," Anna explained. "It was his grandmother's." Brandon studied the antique piece. "Why did you keep it, after everything he did?" "Because for a little while there was something real between us," Anna said honestly. "And because I thought someday you might want something tangible from him." Brandon closed the box. "I think I do want to meet him," he said finally. "Just once. To see for myself what kind of man he is now." 3 days later, George Fletcher returned to Brandon's bistro. The restaurant was closed for a private event, though in reality, it was closed to provide privacy for this meeting. George arrived precisely on time, looking somehow both commanding and uncertain. He carried a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said to Brandon, who stood stiffly beside the bar. "I'm doing this for me, not for you," Brandon replied evenly. "I've wondered about you my whole life. Now I have questions I want answered." George nodded. "That's fair. I'll answer anything you ask." Anna moved toward the kitchen. "I'll give you two some privacy." "No," Brandon said quickly. "Please stay, Mom. Anything he has to say to me, he can say in front of you." They sat at a corner table. An awkward family reunion 20 years delayed. George placed the package on the table but didn't mention it. "So," Brandon began, "why now? What changed?" George considered his answer carefully. "Seeing you that night, recognizing myself in you, it shocked me into confronting what I'd done, what I'd missed." "You didn't miss anything," Brandon said. "Missing something implies you wanted to be there in the first place." George winced visibly. "I deserved that. I was a coward. I was afraid of scandal, of responsibility, of anything that threatened the image I'd built for myself." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," George continued. "What I did is unforgivable." Brandon studied the man before him. Wealthy, powerful, yet somehow diminished in this context. "Were you ever going to look for us?" if you hadn't stumbled into my restaurant by chance. George's hesitation told Brandon everything he needed to know. Then what do you want from me now? George glanced at the package on the table. Just to know you, to have some connection, whatever you're willing to allow. I don't expect to play father suddenly. That role belongs to the person who actually raised you. And if I say no, Brandon asked, if I tell you I want nothing to do with you, then I'll respect your decision, George said simply. But I hope you won't. Brandon glanced at his mother, drawing strength from her steady presence. Then he reached for the box his father had brought. Brandon unwrapped the package slowly. Inside was a wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly expensive, but with an understated elegance that suggested it was chosen with care rather than simply for its price tag. Open it, George said quietly. Brandon lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on velvet, was an antique pocket watch. He lifted it carefully, feeling its surprising weight in his palm. It belonged to my grandfather, George explained. Your great-grandfather. He was a watchmaker in Boston before the Depression. This was the last watch he made before his shop closed. Brandon turned the watch over. On the back was an engraving, a simple F, surrounded by an intricate pattern of swirls. Fletcher, George said. Our family name. My name is Robinson, Brandon said automatically, though without the edge his words might have carried earlier. Of course, George acknowledged. But this is still your heritage if you want it. Anna watched the exchange with mixed emotions. The gift was undeniably thoughtful, not a gaudy display of wealth, but something with history and meaning. Still, she couldn't help wondering if George was trying to buy his way into Brandon's life, as he had tried to buy his way out of responsibility 20 years ago. Thank you, Brandon said finally, returning the watch to its box. It's beautiful. An uncomfortable silence followed. The three of them sat with 20 years of absence between them, a vast canyon of missed moments that no conversation could bridge. George cleared his throat. I took the liberty of ordering dinner. I hope that's acceptable. It should be delivered shortly. Brandon raised an eyebrow. You ordered takeout to a restaurant. From Adeline's, George said. I remember Anna mentioning it was her favorite place back when. He trailed off, clearly unsure how to reference their brief relationship. Anna was surprised he'd remembered such a detail. You recalled that after all this time. Before George could respond, there was a knock at the door. Brandon went to answer it, returning with several bags bearing Adeline's distinctive logo. I haven't eaten there in years, Anna admitted, as Brandon unpacked containers of French cuisine onto the table. Their coq au vin is still excellent, George said. At least I hope it is. I wasn't sure what you'd prefer, Brandon, so I ordered several options. Brandon surveyed the spread. Coq au vin, beef bourguignon, ratatouille, a selection of cheeses and breads, and a bottle of wine. This is thoughtful, he said, gesturing to the food, but you should know that I generally prefer to be the one cooking. Of course you do, George said, with the first genuine smile of the evening. You're a chef, but I thought you might appreciate a night off from your own kitchen. They settled into the meal, the ritual of dining together, creating a semblance of normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances. For a while, they spoke of neutral topics: Chicago's weather, the restaurant business generally, a recent exhibit at the Art Institute that both Brandon and George had visited separately. As they finished the main course, Brandon finally broached a more meaningful subject. Your investigator was thorough, I assume, so you know about my education, my work history. But what do you want to know about me that you couldn't learn from a file? George set down his fork carefully. Everything. What makes you laugh, what books you read, what keeps you up at night, whether you play an instrument or speak another language, who you aspire to be. Why does it matter to you now? Brandon's question wasn't accusatory, but genuinely curious. George looked down at his plate, then back at his son. Because I'm 65 years old, and I've recently realized that none of my achievements mean anything if I can't share them with someone who matters. And despite never being in your life, you matter to me simply because you exist, because you're my son. I'm not your son, Brandon said, not unkindly. Not in any way that counts. Biology is just chemistry. Family is something else entirely. Anna reached over to squeeze Brandon's hand. proud of his composure and wisdom. "You're right," George conceded. "I haven't earned the right to call you my son, but I'd like the chance to earn something. Not fatherhood. That time has passed, but perhaps eventually a relationship of some kind." Brandon considered this as he poured more wine for all three of them. "I don't know if that's possible. What happened between you and my mother? It wasn't just a disagreement or a mistake. You humiliated her. You threw her away like trash." George flinched at the accuracy of the description. "Yes, I did. And you never looked back," Brandon continued. "Never checked if we were okay, if we had enough to eat, if we had a roof over our heads." "I have no excuses," George said quietly. "Only regret that I can't undo." Brandon turned to his mother. "How can you even sit at the same table with him after what he did to you?" Anna considered her response carefully. "For 20 years, I carried anger toward George that shaped many of my decisions. It was justified anger, but holding on to it was also exhausting." She looked directly at George. "I didn't agree to this dinner for your sake. I did it for Brandon, and perhaps a little for myself, to show that what you did didn't break me, that we not only survived but thrived." George nodded, accepting her words. "You did more than thrive. You built something remarkable, both in this restaurant and in your son." Brandon stood abruptly, walking to the small office behind the bar. When he returned, he was holding an envelope. "There's something I want you to see," he said, placing it on the table before George. George opened the envelope and removed a faded photograph. His breath caught visibly as he stared at the image. Anna in a hospital bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a newborn Brandon. The photo had clearly been taken shortly after birth, the baby still bearing traces of delivery, wrapped in a hospital blanket. He turned the photo over, reading the words Anna had written 2 decades ago. "Brandon, my son, you were born rejected, but you will be remembered as a man of honor." George's hands shook slightly as he returned the photo to the envelope. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "This is what a parent's love looks like," Brandon said softly. "Not gifts or money or even regret, this. Showing up every day, building a life from nothing, never giving up even when it would have been easier to do so." He looked at his mother with unbridled admiration. "This is what I've had my whole life, while you were busy building towers and making fortunes." For the first time since Anna had known him, George Fletcher appeared completely at a loss for words. The powerful financier, accustomed to commanding any room he entered, sat humbled before his son's quiet dignity. "I don't know if I can offer you forgiveness," Brandon continued. "That's not something I can give on my mother's behalf. And I don't know if I want or need you in my life going forward." He paused, glancing at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "But I'm willing to consider it," he concluded. "Not because you deserve it, but because I've been raised to believe in second chances, by someone who never got one from you." As Anna watched George absorb these words, she felt a weight lifting. Not forgiveness exactly, but a release. The bitterness that had been her companion for so long was fading, replaced by something unexpected. Pride in the man her son had become despite everything, and perhaps a quiet acknowledgement that even George Fletcher was capable of genuine remorse. The evening had brought no easy resolution, no tearful reconciliation, but perhaps the beginning of something new, fragile and undefined, but possible. 3 months had passed since the dinner at Brandon's bistro. Spring had given way to summer, bringing with it the seasonal menu changes and an influx of tourists to Chicago. The restaurant continued to thrive, with reservations now booked weeks in advance following the glowing Tribune review. Anna wiped down the chef's counter, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the kitchen before the staff arrived. These early morning moments were precious to her. Time to think, to plan, to center herself before the day's chaos began. The soft chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. A text from George. Test results came back. "Doctor wants to discuss options. Don't mention to Brandon yet." Anna frowned, concern rising in her chest. George had mentioned feeling unusually tired during their last conversation, but had dismissed it as stress and age. Apparently, it was something more serious. Their relationship remained complex. Not quite friendship, but no longer the bitter enmity of the past. They'd spoken several times since the dinner, initially about Brandon, then gradually about other things. George had even consulted her about retirement plans. Confessing that the prospect of stepping away from Fletcher Capital Partners filled him with both relief and dread, the door opened and Brandon entered, bringing with him the scent of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. "Morning, Mom," he greeted, setting down a bag of pastries. "I grabbed those almond croissants you like from Marcel's." Anna smiled, tucking away her concerns about George. "Thank you, honey. Coffee's ready." Brandon poured himself a cup, studying his mother's face. "Everything okay? You look worried." "Just thinking about the charity event next week," she lied, hating the deception but respecting George's request. "We've never catered for 300 people before." "We'll nail it," Brandon said confidently. "Professor Roberts' connections at the foundation are already talking about making us their preferred caterer for all their events." Professor Robert had become more than just Brandon's former teacher. He'd become a mentor and friend to them both, helping navigate the bistro's unexpected growth. His friendship had been particularly valuable as Brandon cautiously explored a relationship with George, providing an objective perspective untainted by the past. "Have you heard from George this week?" Anna asked casually, testing the waters. Brandon nodded, his expression neutral. "He invited me to the symphony on Friday. Apparently, it's a family tradition. His father used to take him to the summer concert series when he was my age." Anna noted the careful way Brandon said George rather than my father or dad, a distinction that remained important to him. "Are you going?" Brandon shrugged, but Anna could see he was pleased by the invitation. "Probably. The program includes Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, No. 2. It would be worth it just for that." Their conversation was interrupted by Maria arriving for her shift, already barking orders at the line cooks trailing behind her. Despite repeated discussions about retirement, the sous chef refused to consider leaving her kitchen. "What would you two do without me?" she always asked. And truthfully, neither Anna nor Brandon had a good answer. The day unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Prep work, lunch service, the brief afternoon lull, then preparations for dinner. Anna was double-checking the reservations when she noticed a name that made her pause. Catherine Fletcher, George's ex-wife, had never returned to the bistro after Brandon had declined her investment offer 2 years earlier. Her sudden appearance on the reservation list could not be a coincidence. "Brandon," Anna called, "did you know Catherine Fletcher is booked for dinner tonight?" Brandon looked up from the sauce he was reducing. "Yes. George mentioned she wanted to talk to me about something. And you're okay with that?" He adjusted the flame under his pot. "I'm curious more than anything. George said she's been asking about me since he told her we'd met." "I don't trust her," Anna said flatly. Brandon smiled. "You don't have to. I can handle Catherine Fletcher after all. I learned from the best how to deal with difficult people." He winked at Maria, who snorted in agreement. Catherine arrived precisely at 7, elegant in a designer suit that probably cost more than the bistro's monthly rent. Anna watched from the kitchen doorway as Brandon greeted her personally. Professional and poised. "She looks like she's sucking on a lemon," Maria observed, peering over Anna's shoulder. "Probably can't stand that your boy turned out so well without their money." Anna couldn't disagree. There was something tight and disapproving in Catherine's smile as she surveyed the restaurant. As if looking for flaws to critique, the interaction seemed tense but civil. Brandon spent a few minutes at her table, then returned to the kitchen, his expression thoughtful. "Well," Anna prompted. "She's writing a memoir," Brandon said, sounding bemused. "Wants my blessing to include the full story of her marriage to George, including his indiscretions." Anna's jaw tightened. "She wants to use you as a weapon against him even now." "That's what I figured," Brandon agreed. "I told her I'd consider her request, but that my story is my own to tell or keep private as I choose." "Good answer," Maria approved, returning to her station. Later that night, after closing, Brandon lingered at the bar, nursing a glass of wine. "I've been thinking about Catherine's visit," he said as Anna joined him, "and about George." "What about them?" The way she looked at me, like I was just a pawn in some decades-long game between them. He swirled his wine thoughtfully. "It made me realize something. George might have rejected me initially, but at least he's trying to make amends now. There's something genuine in his efforts. However late they may be." Anna nodded, understanding. "People can change, given enough time and reason. I've decided to give him a real chance." Brandon said quietly. Not as my father. That ship has sailed, but as someone in my life, someone who shares my blood, for whatever that's worth. Anna reached over to squeeze his hand, pride swelling in her chest. This was the man she'd raised, compassionate without being naive, strong enough to offer second chances without compromising his dignity. I think that's wise, she said simply. A week later, they closed the restaurant for a special event, the launch of Brandon's initiative, a new program offering culinary apprenticeships to young people from single-parent homes. The idea had been brewing in Brandon's mind for years, but recent events had crystallized his vision. The bistro was filled with community leaders, local business owners, and prospective students. Anna watched Brandon address the crowd with his characteristic quiet confidence, explaining how the program would provide not just culinary training but also business education and mentorship. My journey began in a small kitchen with just my mother's determination and skill to guide me, he told the audience. Not everyone has the advantages I did. A parent who believed in me unconditionally. This program aims to create a similar foundation for young people with potential but limited resources. Anna blinked back tears of pride. In the front row, George sat listening intently, his expression a mixture of admiration and regret for all he'd missed. Beside him was Professor Robert, nodding approval at his former student's vision. When Brandon announced the program's initial funding, a substantial anonymous donation that would support 10 apprentices in the first year, Anna noticed George's small smile of satisfaction. He had offered to finance the entire initiative, but Brandon had accepted only part of his contribution, insisting that the program have multiple supporters to ensure its independence and sustainability. As the crowd mingled afterward, Anna found herself standing beside George at the edge of the room, both of them watching Brandon field questions from enthusiastic supporters. He's remarkable, George said softly. You did an extraordinary job, Anna. Far better than I could have. It wasn't about doing better than you, Anna replied. It was about doing the best I could for him. George nodded, accepting the gentle correction. I got the treatment scheduled today, he said after a pause. Chemotherapy starts next week. Anna turned to study his face, seeing now the subtle signs she'd missed before, the slight pallor beneath his tan, the new hollowness in his cheeks. Have you told him? Not yet. I don't want to complicate what we're building. It's still so fragile. He deserves to know, Anna said firmly. Don't make the mistake of keeping him at a distance again. Even with good intentions, George sighed. You're right, of course. I'll tell him after the symphony on Friday. Across the room, Brandon caught their eye and smiled, a genuine smile that included them both. In that moment, Anna felt the final remnants of bitterness dissolve. The past couldn't be undone, but the future remained unwritten. As the event wound down and guests departed, Brandon approached them, flushed with success and excitement for the road ahead. Thank you both for being here, he said, including George in his gratitude with a naturalness that would have been unimaginable months earlier. George's hand trembled slightly as he shook his son's hand. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. You've created something important here, something that will outlast all of us. Legacy, Anna thought. Not buildings or bank accounts, but lives touched and improved. Not the name carried forward, but the values passed down. As they stood together in the restaurant that had begun as a tiny takeout counter born of desperation and hope, Anna realized they had come full circle. The rejection that had once defined their lives had transformed into something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps something more valuable. The possibility of grace.